Everybody to tonight's webinar. We've got with the FAA, myself, Jim Chaney. I'm the FAASTeam program manager on the operations side. Roger Williams has got a few things he's got to get done. He's the Atlanta FAASTeam program manager on airworthiness and every other side. And then we have Mike Wilson. I'll let him introduce himself. He's with the FAA also. So take it away, Mike.
Hello, everyone. Good evening to you. I'm Mike Wilson. I'm associated and attached to AFS 850, the FAASTeam branch at headquarters, and responsible for outreach for unmanned aircraft. And we handle a lot of policy and regulatory issues for both our district offices, our public aircraft operators, our recreational operators, and our civil operators. So glad to be here. Thanks a lot, Noah.
Thank you, Mike. It's nice to see you, man. And given the presentation today is Lamar Ellis. He's one of our drone pros for the FAASTeam, and we're just gonna not waste any time and hand it over to my buddy Lamar Ellis.
Hey, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Mike, for being here, and thank you, Roger, for being here too. And hopefully we can clear up some things for you guys. We're going to be talking about some of the Part 107 rules. We're going to be talking about remote identification, which is Part 89. Again, my name is Lamar Ellis, and my company's Drone Education Services, where we are opening minds to drone technology. I am so pleased to be a DronePro, a representative of the FAASTeam, and DronePro means that I'm promoting safety. So I'm really excited about that. I'm also a real estate appraiser by trade, and I have got over 30 years of appraisal valuation of both commercial and residential properties. And it was because of my affiliation with real estate that I developed a class on drone technology and its impact on the real estate environment back in 2014. So I've been teaching all over the United States, and now with this virtual thing, it's gotten me quite a reach. I'm actually teaching an Alaska class in July, which I'm excited about. And finally, I am on the board of the Atlanta chapter of AUVSI. Now, AUVSI stands for the Association of Unmanned Vehicle Systems International. And the cool thing is that this year, the international conference is going to be here in Atlanta in August. So I hope to get a chance to meet all of y'all there. So it's going to be exciting. Things are changing. Today was a big day. So let's get this thing going. Before we really get started, I want to recommend the FAA's website for unmanned aircraft systems. And I want you to go there, and I want you to access it, navigate it, and discover all the cool things that you'll be able to find in there. And like I said, tonight we're going to be talking about remote ID, flying at night, flying over people, flying over vehicles, and hopefully we'll be able to clear up a few of the things that you might be worried about. So the original proposed rule came out on December 31st, 2019, and it was going to give a network ID system, which was going to require UASs to access the cellular network. Well, it was back to the drawing board because there was overwhelming opposition, and a large percentage of the 53,000 comments made were negative. And that was because it required a cellular network connection, which meant a monthly cost that the drone pilot was going to have to absorb to be able to fly their drone. And the problem with cellular networks is that you can have areas of limited or no service, such as remote areas or disaster areas. And there was also that concern of possibly a cybersecurity attack, where if they took out a tower, then nobody'd be able to fly their drones. And then finally, the biggest thing was that all the previous drones that were manufactured before this would go into effect would have to be grounded because it would require internal components to be installed when manufactured. So here we are, December 28th, 2020, they released remote identification of unmanned aircrafts and operations of small unmanned aircraft systems flying at night, operations over people and over moving vehicles, and recurrent testing and training. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. It was published in January of 2021, and it was supposed to be effective as of March 16th of 2021. But it was delayed by a presidential freeze, which was anticipated. And that was not, it's just the new administration coming in and said, we want to take a look at this before we make it effective. So here we are. It's April 21st of 2021, and that's the new effective date. And so we are talking about starting off with remote ID and some new definitions out there. And one of the new definitions is separating the unmanned aircraft from the unmanned aircraft system. Why? Because the FAA now recognizes that manufacturers might make unmanned aircraft controlled by another manufacturer's control station. And so in order to make it a little bit easier to understand, they separated the unmanned aircraft from the systems. Now, who's this new rule going to impact? Well, the new rule is going to impact operators, designers, and manufacturers. It's going to be a broadcast identifier for drones, which is basically a digital license plate. So your drone is now going to have a license plate so that it's going to be a radio frequency, which will identify who is flying the drone. So for unmanned aircraft to be operated in the United States, drones in the near future will be able to share operational information while in flight to people on the ground and to other airspace users. So this is really huge. Now, there's one thing I do want to share with you. We don't have remote ID yet, so we'll be discussing that in a second. Your digital license plate and operational status will be given with this remote ID. So the compliance of this is going to be for manufacturers, September 16th of 2022, and for operators, September 16th of 2023. And I'll explain to you in just a second what it means between being the manufacturer's compliance and the operator's compliance. And as you can see, I've got little videos of drones over there and stuff like that, because I wanted to, I'm going to be referencing that in just a second. So who's going to need it? Well, any unmanned aircraft that requires registration under Part 47 or 48 must comply. Now, if you look at that drone over there, that is a mini Mavic. It is a small drone and it weighs, it is a recreational drone. But if Part 107, if you're using a drone for commercial purposes, it's under 55 pounds, it needs to be registered. So one of the misconceptions that a lot of drone pilots have out there is that they buy this little mini Mavic, it weighs less than the required rate to be registered, and they start flying it for commercial purposes. So be aware, it does, regardless of the weight, if you're using it for commercial purposes, it has to be registered. The other unmanned aircraft that's going to require registration is recreational, 250 grams to 25 kilograms. That mini Mavic actually weighs 249 grams. So they just built it just small enough to keep it under the weight restriction. So who also is going to need this? Well, public safety is going to need remote ID. State governments are going to require remote ID. Local governments, and even tribal governments. Who also needs it? Recreational users. But what's kind of cool is that now with that aircraft registration that you're going to get for as a recreational pilot, you'll get you'll only have one certificate of aircraft registration. So all your drones will be registered with that number. But the new addition is going to be the serial numbers of all the remote ID aircraft. So that is what the manufacturers are producing, the remote ID aircraft. You'll be putting the serial numbers of those aircraft on your registration, and also the serial numbers of the remote ID. So any drone that was built prior to 2022 that did not have remote ID module on it, you're going to be able to put a broadcast module on it. So what's really neat for recreational users is that you're going to be able to add your serial numbers and there's not going to be a cost to you. Now, it's not going to be needed for home-built unmanned aircraft, and that's solely built for education or recreation. But you're only going to be able to fly in what's called a FRIA. And we'll be discussing FRIA in just a little bit, but a FRIA is an FAA recognized identification area. So be aware that's going to be the new thing out there, the FAA Recognized Identification Area, FRIA. It's not going to also be needed for unmanned aircraft of the United States government armed forces or drones that weigh less than 0.55 pounds or less on takeoff for recreation. And then it's not needed for research or educational, but there's going to be some exceptions and deviations to the rules, such as aerospace research or a manufacturer's flight to show compliance. Now, that's my little daughter out there in the backyard flying my little Tello around. What you're not seeing is her crashing it about 10 or 15 times. So it's also not going to be needed for unmanned aircraft flying Part 91 that are transmitting ADS-B out, or for indoor unmanned aircraft operations. Now, I'm talking about recreational and drones that weigh less than 55 pounds, which are Part 107. So I'm not going to be touching on the Part 91s, okay? So we got the three types out there. We got a standard. Now, what is a standard? Let's go into that. Standard is what the manufacturer is going to be putting together. And it's going to be broadcasting messages, elements over a local radio frequency. And those messages are going to include the unique ID, the serial number, or the session ID. And if you look at that little, what I've got, you can see me walking along while the drone's in the air. So that's the other thing that the standard's going to do. It's going to have the unmanned aircraft's location, the latitude, longitude, altitude, but it's also going to show where the control station location of the latitude, longitude, and altitude, along with the unmanned aircraft's velocity, time mark, and emergency status. So you'll be able to, people will be able to see your digital license plate of your drone as it's flying through the sky. The other one is going to be the broadcast module. Now that's for the drones that I own right now that do not have remote ID built into them. And so what you're going to have is that it's going to be a retrofitted or integrated into the existing hardware. And so the message elements are going to basically include a unique ID, which is a serial number only, because that's going to be the serial number of your broadcast module. It's going to show where the aircraft's location, latitude, longitude, and altitude, but it's only going to show where it took off from. So it's going to give the latitude, longitude, altitude of the takeoff location. It's going to also show the drone's velocity, and it's going to have a time mark, but the operation is going to be required to be within visual line of sight. So, and why do they say that? Because you're probably not going to be walking too far away from where you took off that drone. And finally, we got the FRIA. Like I said, this is big because it's the FAA recognized identification area. And so let me show, if you look at that little graph there, you can see that it's a little like a coned in area where people are flying their drones. So what is it? Who can establish a FRIA? Well, it's a CBO or educational institution. Now, a CBO stands for a community-based organization. And the basic community-based organization that most people know about is AMA, which is the Academy of Model Aeronautics. And they have a set of rules that you can fly under for that you fly. But now they're going to have to become FRIAs. When can you apply to be one? Well, there's no deadline to apply, but it's after 18 months after the effective date that I showed you earlier, which is going to be September 16th of 2022. Where can a FRIA be located? Well, the FAA is going to evaluate your location and tell you if you could do it or not. So we got educational institutions and CBOs that will be applying for these, and it's basically going to be in controlled airspace. So operations are going to be visual line of sight only. They're going to be within the geographic boundary of the established area. So the FAA is going to you're going to tell them where you're going to be flying, and that'll be your established boundaries. They're going to expire after 48 months or 4 years, but you can renew them. And if necessary, the FAA will terminate them, such as for safety or security reasons. So I put in some important questions that are always getting asked about this. And question one is, will Recreational Fliers be able to add a UAS serial number to their existing registration on a remote ID? Now, if you remember, I did tell you, yes. While you have the ability to switch remote ID modules between drones, each drone flown with that module will have to be added to the registration list of drones with an identifying drone serial number. So if you get a drone that you bought from a manufacturer with that, let's say you're flying recreationally only, and you buy a drone from the manufacturer that's got remote ID in it, well, that remote ID serial number is going to go on your registration list. If you have a broadcast module, then that broadcast module serial number will go on your registration. So Recreational Fliers, this is the best part about it. They won't have to pay an additional fee every time they update it. So how does remote ID work with the UAS that doesn't have a serial number? I guess I just answered that. Well, if you don't have a serial number issued by the manufacturer, they don't want the serial number of the drone on your registration. They want the serial number of the remote ID. Now, one of the things that is popping up today is that remote ID has not gotten the radio frequency yet. The remote ID is not out yet. Another important question, if you have remote ID installed and operating, what is Joe Public going to be able to see about the aircraft? Is it going to be viewable with a cell phone app? Well, this is one of the biggest things that when I'm talking to my colleagues about, and this is the one that's worried them. And yes, all unmanned aircraft will broadcast the serial number, which is going to be your digital license plate, the unmanned aircraft's latitude, longitude, and altitude for standard ID, and the control station time mark emergency status. For the broadcast module, which is going to be attached to the drone, it'll show only the drone's takeoff latitude, longitude, altitude, but it'll just show where it took off from. Now, Joe Public will not have access to any personal information. They won't have any access to your registration information. They're just going to get that serial ID. So what will happen is if they're going to turn somebody in, they're going to give that digital license plate to the FAA representative. But they should be able to obtain an app that will give the information available to anyone. So it looks like that's going to be something that Joe Public's going to be able to, if they want to, have on their cell phone and can see who's flying in the area and why, when, and where they're going. Well, now we're getting into the confusing part. It's the Part 107 Subpart D, operation of small unmanned aircraft systems over people. That's operations of people and moving vehicles, night operations, and the recency testing and training. And I am so happy to announce that I passed today. I took the test so that I would be up to date if there were any changes that were made. So I'm excited to be talking about this. But let's go into, it's going to be the next step for integrating unmanned aircraft in the national airspace. It has to happen because we've got to have increased operational flexibility. It's going to permit routine operations of small UASs at night over people and over vehicles. But let me stop right there. Over people and over vehicles are going to be requiring a written waiver until we have the radio frequency for remote ID. By taking the recurrent testing, am able to fly at night until remote ID becomes permanent in 2023. So under certain conditions, without waiver exemption, once there's remote ID, we'll be able to do other operations, possibly over people and over vehicles. So there are 4 categories. You've got categories 1 through 3 from the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, and PRM are based on injury risk to people on the ground, and category 4 is based on the airworthiness certificate under Part 21. That's to operate initial airworthiness under Part 107. Now, there's not going to be any changes to Section 44809 for recreational pilots, and those are those 8 tenets that you need to know to be a recreational pilot. So operations over people and moving vehicles. All the categories of different requirements and weight limit, exposed rotating parts, safety defects, injury limits, means and declaration of compliance, labeling, that's the registration of your drone, and where you can fly over people with or without remote ID. And finally, sustained flight over people. So let's see if we can cover these. Category 1 is a drone that weighs less than 0.55 pounds. Now it has to have no exposed rotating parts. This is one that I get questioned on a lot. Does a prop guard denote no exposed rotating parts? And so it's as long as you don't get lacerated or cut by that drone. I believe that we will be making determinations over that in the near future. And no sustained flights over open air assemblies of people unless you have remote ID. So you can't fly over people unless you have remote ID. Now you can if you get a written waiver at this time. Aircraft, category 2, aircraft meets the safety requirements, injury severity limits, and no exposed rotating parts. And again, no sustained flight over open air assemblies unless RID compliant, which is remote ID. Category 3 is what movies and televisions are using drones for, and that aircraft are meeting safety requirements. Again, no exposed rotating parts, but it is closed and restricted sites. And then category 4 is the aircraft meets the airworthiness requirements. So you got no sustained flight over open air assemblies unless it's remote ID compliant. And operating limitations must not prohibit operations over people. So again, want to make this clear. It's still the waiver process until the remote ID comes out, and then we'll be addressing that. Okay. So this is what happened today, flying at night in recurrent training. And I'm so glad we've got recurrent training. I have already spent over $450 getting my knowledge test redone every 24 months. So it's really nice. The recurrent training is free. So I did that today. It's going to allow routine operations of small drones at night without a waiver. And it amends the training and testing, and provides a couple of other small changes. So we've got 2 conditions out there. We've got the remote pilot in command must complete an updated current initial knowledge test or updated recurrent training, which is what I did today. This was my recurrent training test. And it's got to have anti-collision lighting visible for at least 3 statute miles and have a flash rate sufficient enough to avoid a collision. And I just purchased myself a module to attach that has got anti-collision lighting to it, and it can be seen according to the brochure for 3 miles. So, well, I got to figure out how to turn it on first. Anyway, so remote ID flying for nighttime flying will be in effect for 2023. So that says remote ID for nighttime flying. So if you take the recurrent testing, you'll be able to fly at night now. And daylight waivers that were issued before March 16th of 2021 are going to expire on May 17th, 2021. So if you've got a daylight waiver, you're going to have to go and take your recurrent testing to be compliant after May 17th. You're no longer going to have to pass that recurrent aeronautical knowledge test every 24 calendar months. That is so awesome. I'm so glad to see that. And it maintains a provision for pilots that hold a Part 61. Now, those pilots that hold a Part 61 are the pilots that can actually fly real planes, that manned aircraft. And they have to complete a initial flight review every 24 months, either the initial or the recurrent training. So here's the FAA safety.gov site. And if you go to that site, please, if you're a recreational pilot, register on this site. The great thing about the FAA safety site is that I get NOTAMs and I get TFRs. If there's VIP movement, or if there's something going on that will tell me that I can't fly in an area, I'll get notification a couple of days in advance. But over there in the what I put the box in is where you can get your recurrent training. And I went over there and I clicked on the Part 107. I was a non Part 61 pilot, so I did that training today. and it took me about 2 hours. There's over 150 slides there, but it's really informative. I really like it better than the knowledge test because it gets into risk mitigation, crew management, maintenance of your drone, things that aren't really covered that well on the knowledge test. Now, the subjects in the training and testing, they added night operations. So they asked me some questions about night operations. Like one of the things I saw was that you kind of have to look at a 5 to 10 degree angle away from the light of the drone so that you can see it, because there is night blindness by looking straight at it. And it's free. So if you look, the FAASafety.gov, if you don't know anything about it, please check it out. This is where you're going to get, you're going to have to get there once you're a Part 107 pilot anyway. Might as well become familiar with it. And you also get the notifications as to what's going on possibly in your area. So that has the night subject areas. And also you've got the courses. So you've got 2 old Part 61s for initial and recurrent, and then new updated recurrent course for the non-Part 61 pilots. We also have some other 107 changes that have occurred. And this rule is a regulatory step to anticipate increased demand for flexibility in small unmanned aircraft systems operations for uses in such as motion picture filming, news gathering, law enforcement, photography, and construction. This was a project I was working on with Flyworks, and this was something we actually had broadcast on television for a television show. So this is going to be increasing the flexibility of doing operations like this. Now, remote pilots, and this is a big one. You must now have in your possession your remote pilot certificate, which is, for me, the laminated card that says I'm a Part 107 pilot, my drone registration, which I've got printed out and I've stuck it in my drone case, and a picture ID, which is my license. So you now are going to be required to have this in your possession, because you must present those documents upon request from the FAA or the National Transportation Safety Board or federal, state, and local law enforcement officers. So that's a big change, and that's, I think, one of the things that's kind of necessary for this to go further, is that we have to have some the ability to see if the pilots actually have the documents that they need to be able to fly. Now, a remote pilot must also make available to the FAA any document, record, report required to be kept under regulations of Part 107, which are your flight records and your maintenance records. It doesn't have to be on you when you're flying every time, but if you get requested, you're going to have to be able to supply flight records or maintenance records. And maintenance records are, let's say you change the props on your drone, or have done any kind of maintenance whatsoever. It shows that you've done your risk mitigation and you're doing everything you can to make sure that that drone flies safely. The other changes, like I covered before, an unmanned aircraft versus an unmanned aircraft system. So an unmanned aircraft flies over people, but a control station does not. So be aware, there's now a difference between unmanned aircraft and unmanned aircraft systems. Now, other is the administration of tests by the FAA is going to change. They just did a solicitation for test administrators. They're not going to be compensated by the FAA, but they're going to be selected upon meeting requirements. And to be considered, you had to have your you had to apply by March 31st of last month. And I flew through this because there's always questions. Again, my name is Lamar Ellis. I'm a Part 107 remote pilot, FAA Safety Team DronePro, and a real estate valuation. There is my email address and my phone number. Please, I love talking about this. I love trying to help everybody out. I'm so glad that we've got some FAA representatives with us today. If you've got any questions, if I can't answer them, we've got people here that can. So, please, I'm going to open up the floor to questions right now. So do we have any questions? Hey. Okay.